What is up, guys? In today's video, I'm going to be going over what I think is the best loadout for Fortnite Zero build in Season 4 after the nerfs and updates we have gotten. As always, if you guys do enjoy this video, find it helpful, informative, or interesting, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you like to see more, and comment down below what your favorite setup has been since the update. Because in the last video I made on this topic, Fortnite has actually nerfed the Wrecker Revolver and also made it to where you can't alternate between two Wrecker, or just two revolvers, two pistols in general, which is something that the last loadout I feel like really revolved around. They've removed the medallions, which affects the pacing of the game and how pretty much every fight plays out. And then they also removed the shockwave launcher, which again affects the pacing of the game. And with these balance changes, I don't really think there is any set in stone best setup in the game, in my opinion, but there are several good loadouts, and it really just kind of depends on your preference and your playstyle. With the pacing of the game changing so considerably, that also changes the items that are kind of ideal to like perform best in that style of the game. Regardless of what path you want to go, I think the same 4 core items will kind of be consistent regardless of which way you choose to go. And then the final item will kind of really depend on the playstyle you want. So we're going to go over those 4 items first, and then I'm going to go over the different options later on. For starters, I think you'll definitely want a shotgun style weapon. Fortnite has always been like a shotgun dominated game in close range, and my preference is still going to be the Wrecker Revolver. Even with the nerfs, the range is still incredible for a shotgun style weapon, and when aimed in, you have a very accurate and very consistent pellet spread, which should give you good damage if your aim is good. And with how the other changes have slowed down the pace of the game, I really value the Wrecker Revolver's range even more than I did before, and more than I would in like a normal Fortnite season. Like last season, for example, the Sentinel Pump didn't have the most range, but it didn't really matter because the game played out so quick and we had so much mobility that it was easy to get into those close range fights and it was easy to push people. But with the game being slower now, I feel like you get in a lot of, I don't know if awkward would be the right word, but I get in a lot of fights where it's like not quite shotgun range and also not quite AR range, and the Wrecker Revolver really thrives in those situations. It's just very good, very consistent. It has an okay enough fire rate to where you don't need to swap every time you shoot it, and depending on how the fight plays out, a lot of times you're going to be playing off of cover with this and not really in a dedicated like up in the opponent's face shotgun fight, and the Wrecker Revolver just excels there. Obviously you're going to want an AR as well, and I think for this season all of the choices are really good, and it's just up to you and whatever you like most. So my personal preference is going to be the OXR rifle, as it's the best at longer ranges. But if you prefer the Hammer or the Fury, that's completely fine. They're all good. Both the Hammer and the Fury are much better than the OXR in close range. But with how the Revolver plays, I don't end up needing my AR for that as much. I end up using the Revolver in a lot of fights where like I would have preferred the Hammer over the Fury or over the OXR. So I feel like your shotgun could also impact this. If you're using the Sentinel Pump, having the Hammer or the Fury for a better spray weapon than the OXR would make more sense. But with the Revolver, I find that I don't really feel like I'm lacking because the OXR isn't as good at close range. And so those two weapons just fit really well together, I think, and cover all the ranges that I need perfectly fine. And with how frequently players are running away this season, having the OXR for like those longer range situations where someone's just trying to like shockwave away, I really like. Another core item is going to be heals, and this is another choice that is just mostly going to be preference and down to what you get. You know, if you have 1 big pot or 2 legendary slurps, obviously you're probably going to want to take the legendary slurps. My preference since the updates has mostly been Flowberry Fizz, and this is an item that I was not the biggest fan of in Chapter 5. It feels like it takes so long to start healing to me compared to some of the other heals. But with how the pacing of the game has slowed down, as I touched on before, I find myself really appreciating that Flowberry aspect, that floaty movement, to not only get around the map faster, but also have more movement in fights. Because when we had the medallions, you know, you could slide and double jump around and be really crazy in fights, no problem. But with the removal of those, the game feels so slow. Like, how fights play out can feel so slow. And having the zero gravity kind of floaty jump with the Wrecker Revolver feels really good. And I think in a lot of fights, if you go into the fight with the Flowberry aspect, and you have the revolver and you can just kind of easily jump over your opponent's head and just float around, I think you have a huge advantage in that fight. And as I kind of touched on before, I don't know how to describe it, but since the removal of the medallions and the removal of the shockwave launcher, people have been playing so much slower. And if you're trying to push someone that's just holding cover, I like having the low gravity jump for that as well. So traditionally an item that I didn't enjoy as much as other players, the Flowberry Fizz, I've actually been enjoying quite a bit since this change, and that's kind of been my favorite healing item to carry because it also doubles as mobility in those fights and can kind of just straight up win you the fight in those situations. It also helps you for getting more out of your mobility, which is something that's going to matter because the mobility we currently have is shockwaves and crash pads, and with how these work, you know, you only have a certain amount of them. And so getting that little bit extra out of your shockwave and being able to just use one shockwave in a situation where maybe you would rather end up having to use two if you weren't flowberried can be a huge difference maker. And when it comes to the mobility, as I said, we have shockwaves and crash pads. I think you just got to end up taking whichever one you have or whichever one you have more of at the moment, because they're both, you know, consumable items that each one you use, you need to find more to replenish. It's not just like a one set in stone mobility item you get. Mobility and finding mobility and conserving mobility has been much more of a factor since the removal of the shockwave launcher. And I think both these choices are good. My preference would be shockwaves, but if I have the choice of like one shockwave or 6 crash pads, I'm definitely going to be taking the crash pads, especially if it's later on in the game. If I'm early on in the match, I'll sometimes take less shockwaves just because I'm hoping that I can find more over time. But once we get deeper into the game, you know, sometimes you just got to take what you get. So I would recommend just being good with both of these. And it will probably vary game to game which one you end up having to use. So those are our 4 slots so far. The Wrecker Revolver, the OXR Rifle, Flowberry Fizz, and Shockwaves. And this final slot is where your playstyle and your preference is really going to come into play. So Fortnite made it to where you can't shoot the Wrecker Revolver and then swap to another pistol and shoot right away. And so double Wrecker Revolver was removed from the game essentially, but you can still use another shotgun and combo that with the Wrecker Revolver. I don't know if this is going to change at some point. It probably will after I upload this video, but as it stands now, you can still double pump with something like the Wrecker Revolver and the Sentinel Pump. And if you enjoy doing that, it is a very lethal combo in close range, and it already was very good before the changes. The main reason I'm not doing this constantly now, I feel like, is, as I kind of touched on, the pacing of the game just feels much slower. And when playing against those slower fights in kind of more mid-range, it's like kind of harder to force the close range fights. I don't know how to describe it, but double pump is still very good, but there's a lot of fights that happen now where it's just like not as necessary. But if you want to excel in close range fights, you can still combo like Wrecker Revolver and Sentinel Pump, and you will have a huge advantage in most close range fights that you go into. Another option for this final slot is going to be something like the Swarm Strike Rocket Launcher or the Bug Blaster. And both of these are obviously incredibly good because you can just shockwave up and then shoot down. And in the case of the Swarm Strike Rocket Launcher, get pretty close to just one-shotting somebody with it. But both of these options also work exceptional with how the pacing of the game has slowed down, because there's a lot of situations where like you're kind of behind cover and the enemy is behind cover and there's just kind of like a stalemate going on, and you can use the splash damage of the rocket launcher or the bug blaster to force those people out of cover or damage them when they are behind cover. And when you're going to push somebody, pushing them with a fully charged bug blaster and then shooting them with it as you kind of land on them and then swapping to the revolver for the finish is something that works out exceptionally well. And with the use of this, I feel like I don't end up missing double pump as much because I deal 100 damage basically on my way to the enemy anyways. So these items were already good, but with the removal of the medallions and the removal of the shockwave launcher and how the pacing of the game has slowed down, that splash damage aspect to like force enemies out from behind cover or damage them when they're behind cover is something that I think works really well, because it's harder to push people now than it previously was. Another item that is very good is going to be the exotic shockwave launcher. This is an item that a lot of people misunderstand. It's bad if you use it on it's bad if you use it on yourself as mobility, but what is good for this is displacing enemies and putting them up into the sky and making them an easy elimination. That's kind of like defenseless. So if you want to push an enemy, you shockwave onto them and then shoot them with this, then you can just look up and, you know, fry them out of the sky. So the exotic shockwave launcher, I think, is very good. And if you want to carry that in the final slot, I think that is perfectly reasonable. And then the final other recommendation I have is just going to be double mobility. So, you know, shockwaves and crash pads at the same time. If you end up finding a lot of them, that's something that can also work well in this final slot. And you will probably have a movement advantage on every other player you encounter if you're doing this, because most people aren't carrying double mobility at the moment. And so those are the choices for the final slot. Either an additional shotgun to double pump with, something like the Swarm Strike rocket launcher, or the Bug Blaster to, you know, splash damage enemies and force them out from behind cover. The exotic shockwave launcher is something that's, you know, incredibly good but rare to find. And then double mobility is like a kind of basic vanilla option, but is also still, you know, very good and very effective, and is something that allows you to play a bit faster with the pacing of the game even being slower. But that is going to be it for this video. As always, if you guys did find this to be helpful, informative, or interesting, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you like to see more, comment down below what your favorite setup has been thus far, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.